They say true love begins when you find someone and suddenly everything makes sense. But it was different for me. What I felt when I first saw him wasn't peace. It was bewilderment. As if the ground had shifted without warning. I was used to the predictable, to clean, polite relationships where no one exposed themselves too much, where the absence of conflict was mistaken for harmony. I had already experienced loves that fit into frames, beautiful to show, empty to live. I was at that stage of life where you convince yourself that maybe that's just it. A little affection, a little company, and a succession of days that drag on with polite silence. I learned to be strong, not to expect grand gestures or sweeping endings. I got used to not bothering, to accepting halves disguised as wholes, and I confess, I became good at it, good at seeming satisfied, good at not demanding, good at not needing anyone, until he appeared, and not with flowers, nor with the right words, nor with that kind of easy-to-like charisma. No, he arrived with the weight of someone carrying the world on their shoulders, with the tired eyes of someone who had loved wrong too many times and blames himself for still wanting to try. He didn't fit into anything I thought I needed, but even so, something about him stopped me, not by what he said, but by what he hid. And it was there that my heart, the one I had trained so well to stay silent, began to speak. At first, I tried to resist. I spent nights repeating to myself that I deserved something lighter, simpler. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about deserving. It was about truth. And the truth is that before him, I couldn't pretend. I saw myself, stripped of all my defenses, facing someone who didn't promise to complete me, but who, just by existing in that imperfect and sincere way, made me feel whole. It was scary, because loving someone like that wasn't like leaning on a firm wall. It was like walking in the dark, hand in hand, with someone who also stumbled. And even so, or maybe because of it, I wanted to stay. To stay not out of certainty, but out of choice. And in that silent choice, in that moment when everything screamed for me to turn my back, I knew. There began a story that wouldn't be easy. But it would be mine. It wasn't hard to like him. What was hard was living with everything he brought without apologizing, because he didn't hide his pain, didn't mask his absences, didn't try to be someone different to please me. He was like an old house, beautiful but full of cracks, full of jammed doors that creaked every time they tried to be opened. And yet, it was there that I wanted to enter. I remember our first dates like someone remembers a crossing over rough terrain. Sometimes we laughed like old friends. Sometimes we fell silent for 2 long minutes, trying to understand if the other would endure our silences. He looked at me like someone who wanted to trust, but no longer knew how. And I, who have always been made of words and impulses, learned from him to value the space between one sentence and another, to respect the time it takes for the heart to get used to being seen. Sometimes he would withdraw without warning, like a wounded animal that fears hurting those who try to get close. He would disappear into himself, trapped in memories I didn't dare invade. And every time that happened, what hurt me wasn't the distance itself. It was the awareness that, if I wanted, I could leave with all the justifications in the world, and no one would judge me for it. I had my life, my plans, my options. I didn't need to cling to someone who didn't know how to promise anything beyond his uncertain presence. But it was in those moments that something stronger ignited in me. A love that didn't come from need, nor from the hope of fixing. It came from the raw and free choice to see that man whole, with his flaws, his fears, his escapes, and still want to stay. No one ever taught me that true love sometimes hurts this way. Not from being hurt, but from demanding surrender without guarantees. And that's exactly what I felt, that every time he got lost from me, I had to choose whether to stay there, waiting by the roadside, with the door open, without demanding that he come back different, just wishing he would come back. And every time I chose to stay, it was like a small, silent revolution happened inside me. I wasn't waiting for a perfect love. I was choosing a real love. Time, with its subtle way of testing everything fragile, didn't take long to put what we felt to the test. There were days when his silence seemed louder than any of my words. Days when I wondered, silently, if love was enough to fill the gaps he carried inside his chest. Sometimes, while he talked about mundane things, the weather, work, news that barely interested him, I saw in his eyes the distance of someone who is there, but also somewhere else. Places I didn't know, pain I couldn't measure, and yet I stayed. Not out of pity, not out of blind insistence, but because something in me knew that the truest love is the one that remains even without applause, even without guarantees, even when the other doesn't know how to reciprocate in the way we expect. Sometimes, at night, lying in a bed too cold for just one body, I wondered how far I was capable of going. If there was a limit to this silent surrender. If, at some point, I would also tire of being the one who stayed while he got lost in his own shadows. But it was in those hours that I clung to the small things, to the way he looked at me without realizing it, as if he were seeing something precious, to the awkward way he tried to take care of me on his best days, to the way his silence, even painful, was honest, never cruel. And so, day after day, I came to understand that loving someone isn't about receiving what we expect. It's about seeing the other whole and, even so, choosing to stay, choosing again and again. Even when the heart, in pieces, whispers that it would be easier to leave. I knew I wasn't choosing an easy path, but I also knew that in some silent part of my soul, easy was never what I sought. I wanted what time wouldn't erase, and I was willing to fight for it, even if the battle was invisible to everyone but me. The first time he truly withdrew wasn't announced with harsh words or fights. It was much worse. It happened in silence, in the exchange of glances that no longer met, in the automatic gestures without intention, without presence. It was as if he were there physically, but had already left in spirit, carried away by ghosts I couldn't reach. At first I tried not to see. We convince ourselves of many things to protect what we love. I clung to the memories of the good days, to the few words that still escaped him like sparks of light. But inside, I knew he was getting lost. And there was a painful, almost unbearable part in recognizing that no matter how much I reached out my hand, he needed to want to come back on his own. It wasn't about me. It never was. It was about his internal battles, those that came long before me and that perhaps would always be a part of him. Even so, it hurt. It hurt in a way that no past disappointment ever hurt, because this time I had chosen to love with open eyes, chosen not just the best of him, but everything, the fear, the distance, the vulnerability that made him run. Every silence between us was like a wall rising brick by brick before my will to stay. But it was also, in some twisted and difficult way, proof of the kind of love I wanted to live, the one that doesn't give up in the first winter. And so, day after day, even feeling the cold that spread between us, even hearing the echoes of fear asking me to give up, I remained. Not because I was blind, but because, precisely by seeing everything, the pain, the mess, the imperfection, I knew that true love isn't made of easy days. It's forged in the fire of difficult choices. And I was there, whole, present, waiting not for him to be perfect, but for him to find his way back to me. There was a day when the wait became almost unbearable. It wasn't a significant event, nor a fight, nor a formal farewell. It was just another one of those silent days, when I felt like I was talking to the shadow of a man and not to him for real. I sat in the car after another strange afternoon, his words echoing dryly in my memory, and I cried alone. It wasn't a cry of revolt or anger. It was the exhausted cry of someone who had loved beyond what pride would allow, of someone who knew they could leave and yet chose to stay, and in staying also got hurt. At that moment, leaning against the steering wheel, I seriously thought about leaving for good, about protecting myself from the pain, about starting over with someone simpler, more willing, easier to love. I knew no one would blame me. Maybe they would even call me wise for not insisting on something that so many would call imprudence. But between silent sobs and the bitter taste of doubt, a truth emerged within me, clear as the light that pierced the dirty car window. True love isn't about the absence of pain. It's about staying when loving also requires sacrifice. It's about recognizing the broken parts of the other and deciding to love them too, even knowing that sometimes they will cut you. And it was in that instant, in the solitude of that small, forgotten parking lot, that I understood. I would choose him again, even knowing all the pain, even knowing it wouldn't be easy, even knowing he might again get lost, and not because I like to suffer, but because my love for him wasn't conditional on ease. It was a decision, a complete surrender. I took a deep breath, dried my tears, and that night, when he called me like someone apologizing without being able to find the right words, I simply replied with the firm voice of someone who had already made their choice. I'm here. And being there at that time meant much more than forgiving an absence. It meant understanding that the love I wanted to build wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. And for me, that was what mattered most. It wasn't immediate. There wasn't a grand gesture, nor a sudden turnaround. The change in him was almost imperceptible at first. A gaze that lingered a little longer before looking away. A short message sent in the middle of an ordinary day. An awkward attempt to be present even without knowing how. It was like seeing parched earth trying to absorb the first rain after years of drought, and I, who already knew his absences by heart, noticed the difference without needing words. It wasn't just about me. It was about him finally trying to fight against the walls that protected him, but also imprisoned him. The distance that had so often hurt me began to shrink, not by magic, but by effort. And it was in this new space, still fragile and full of insecure silences, that our love began to rebuild itself. Not as a return to the beginning, but as something deeper, truer. There were days when I still felt the fear pulsing inside him, like a shadow difficult to erase. But unlike before, now he didn't run. He stayed, sometimes in silence, sometimes stumbling over words, sometimes just looking at me as if he finally understood what it meant to be chosen and to remain. And I changed too, because truly loving someone isn't just about accepting the good times. It's about recognizing that in every crack, there's a chance for something new to grow. The life between us, which so often seemed hanging by a thread, now began to blossom in the unexpected, in a simple touch, in a silly conversation, in a comfortable silence where before there was only distance. And it was in this imperfect and beautiful rhythm that I realized I wasn't just waiting for him to choose me. I was also choosing, every day, again and again, to love the real man before me, and not the idea of him that I might have invented to protect myself. And it was this choice, made without glamour, without witnesses, without promises, that began to transform us, not like a fairy tale, but like two souls who, even carrying the weight of the world, still decided to stay. The real reunion didn't happen on a special date, nor was it marked by rehearsed words. It happened on an ordinary day, in a simple instant when he finally allowed me to see not only who he was, but who he wanted to be by my side. We were sitting opposite each other, without the protection of old walls, without the armor of excuses, just the two of us, with all our imperfections spread between us, and he was the one who broke the silence first. Not with a beautiful declaration, but with a question loaded with fear. "Why are you still here?" It wasn't an empty question. It was the outpouring of someone who didn't feel deserving, of someone who expected at any moment that I would also give up on him, as so many had done before. I looked at him, at his tired eyes, at his restless hands, at the raw vulnerability he no longer tried to hide. And there, without the slightest doubt, the answer was born within me like something that had always been there, just waiting to be said. With a choked voice, but without hesitation, I replied, "Because I would choose you 1,000 times, and 1,000 times more." It didn't matter how many times he had withdrawn. It didn't matter how many scars he carried. What mattered was that despite everything, I would choose him again. Not because he was perfect, but because, even in his most broken moments, he was real, and at that moment, seeing the silent disbelief in his eyes slowly transform into something that looked like hope, I knew that finally he was understanding. That being chosen like that, with all the pain and flaws, wasn't a debt to be paid. It was a gift to be received. And that's what both of us, in different ways, were learning. That the strongest love isn't the one that demands proof, nor the one that imposes conditions. It's the love that chooses to stay, chooses to believe, chooses to start over, even when everything inside you has given up trying. After that day, something between us changed silently, almost sacredly. It wasn't as if all the fears had evaporated, nor as if our story had magically become easy. His scars were still there, just as mine were. But for the first time, there was no longer the urgency to flee or to protect oneself. He stayed, whole, present. With all his uncertainties and misaligned pieces, he stayed. And he kept staying. Day after day, in the small gestures, in the looks that now didn't look away, in the conversations interrupted only by the necessary pauses of someone who no longer fears silence. I learned to see him again, not as a project to be fixed, but as a human being under construction, as deserving of love as I was. And he learned to accept that being loved wasn't a debt that needed to be paid with perfection. It was just that, being. We were there, the two of us, finally in the same rhythm, breathing the same air, sharing not only good times but also the difficult spaces, without one having to save the other. And in this courageous simplicity, our love matured, without empty promises, without deaf demands, just with the daily, conscious, and silent decision to look at each other and choose, again and again. Even on the days when doubt visited, even on the nights when fear still knocked at the door, our love wasn't built on what was easy. It was built on resistance, on persistence, on surrender without guarantees. And there, in that in-between time where many couples get lost trying to change each other, we found ourselves precisely by accepting that love isn't about transforming the other, but about walking alongside, even when the road is full of curves and stones. Because what united us wasn't perfection. It was the daily choice to be a refuge for each other, even knowing that the world outside would always be a little colder. Time passed, and with it came the inevitable seasons. Days of warmth and easy laughter, days of winter and long silences. But now I knew. I knew that truly loving wasn't about avoiding the storms. It was about knowing where to find shelter when they came. And my shelter was him. Not because he was immune to flaws, or because life by his side was made only of perfect moments, but because despite all his imperfections, he chose me back, not with beautiful words, but with presence. With eyes that even tired, sought mine in the midst of routine, with hands that looked for me in the dark without needing permission, and above all, with the simple but immense act of staying. There was an afternoon, one of those without great events, when we walked hand in hand in silence, each carrying the weight and lightness of their own story. He squeezed my hand a little tighter, looked at me as if wanting to engrave that moment in his soul, and said, almost in a whisper, like someone afraid the wind would steal the words, "I would choose you, again, always." And at that moment, I understood that all the love I had offered, all the silent choice to stay, even when it would have been easier to leave, had finally found an echo, not in promises, not in guarantees, but in the simplest and most beautiful truth that exists: to be chosen. Chosen not for the absence of difficulties, but despite them. Chosen in the mess, in the fear, in the ordinary day. Chosen because deep down, the only thing that really matters is finding someone who sees all your broken parts, and yet, without hesitation, says, "It's you." And so, between simple steps and courageous hearts, our story continued. Not as a perfect tale, but as something infinitely rarer, a true story, written each day with the silent choices of two hearts that, even tired, never stopped choosing each other. Today, looking back, I see that true love didn't come to me like an explosion of fireworks or like a flawless fairy tale. It arrived silently, with uncertain steps, with tired eyes and hands that trembled with the fear of touching and losing. And I, who always thought love was something that found us ready, learned that love, for real, is something we build, with daily choices, with silent forgiveness, with patience that doesn't ask for applause. Choosing someone 1,000 times isn't an empty promise. It's a silent commitment that we renew even on the days when love seems small, tired, ordinary. And it is precisely on these days, more than on any other, that I perceive the greatness of everything we have built. Life never promised us ease, but it gifted us with the chance to choose. And I chose. I chose that imperfect, complex man, beautiful in his vulnerability, who once thought no one would stay. And he, still with his fears, still with his internal struggles, chose to stay too. And it is in this everyday gesture of remaining, of starting over, of forgiving the falls and celebrating the small, silent victories that I found the love story. I always sought not the perfect story to tell, but the real story to live. And if I had to do it all over again, every tear, every doubt, every sleepless night, I would. I would choose him 1,000 times and 1,000 times more.